And they melded together and basically kind of merged together, and that helped the kingdom stay together because they had some sense of identity. They had some sense of attachment to each other. Ouchie. So that's another big issue. That's also why you don't see the Vikings holding on to a lot of territory, because they were the same way. Now, eventually they did. Eventually, like the Saxons came in and stayed in England. But you'll notice when they did that, they also started adopting English ways. It's just still kind of the way it works. How long before I level up again? 2 more fights. It's going to take forever, isn't it? I'm not going to get to level 50, am I? I don't think so. Oh, well. Such a shame. Alright. Come on. Ta-ya!
Just give up.
So anyway, so the Hellenistic kingdoms ran around, and they stuck around for, like I said, about 300 years until they were conquered by Rome. And then they became part of the Roman Empire. Ta-da! As far as military history is concerned, the Hellenistic Empire generally kept the same form of combat that Alexander and his father had created, the Macedonian phalanx. You know, the very long spears and lining up like in a big column, really compact together and charging your enemy into submission. And it worked really well for like 300 years, you know, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So what did happen? What caused them to get defeated and get changed? How did Rome beat them? Well, Rome was an innovator. Ha! And basically what they did is they saw the Legion, and the Legion, I mean, not the Legion, the Phalanx, and they noticed that the Phalanx had weaknesses. And it did. The Phalanx did have weaknesses. As strong as it was only really effective if, A, you had lots of flat terrain. If you did not have flat terrain, you couldn't gain any momentum to get a charge up. You couldn't turn easily. You weren't very flexible. You were basically like a giant hammer. And once you got going, you kept going that direction. And God forbid there's a river in your path, or a bunch of rocks, or going uphill, or anything like that. You can't get the momentum needed. And because of this, people who use phalanx tended to prefer fighting on plains, very level ground. And Rome saw this lack of flexibility and thought that they could improve on it. And so they kept working on it, and over the years they kind of took the phalanx and they modified it into the Legion. And what the Legion was, instead of it being one massive block of soldiers with spears and stuff, it was more like a checkerboard. You'd have a square of soldiers, and then a square of nothing, and then a square of soldiers, and then a square of nothing. And then imagine like a checkerboard, and the Legion is all the red squares. Does that make sense? So like on the front line, it's almost like you have soldiers and then an empty space, soldiers and an empty space, and then behind that empty space you have another square of soldiers. And this did tons of things that improved on what the phalanx could not. For example, one, since you had an uneven line, up until then, battles were, you have a solid line of soldiers run against a solid line of soldiers, and they clash in the middle, and then the strongest one wins. Well, this didn't work like that, because this had holes in it on purpose. And so a lot of times what would happen, yay, is the solid line of soldiers would meet the Legion, and some would clash against the front line, and others would move on into that hole because there was nothing to stop them. And they would move into that hole, and then they'd get attacked from 3 sides, and that little group would get massacred because they'd run into the groups further back, and then they'd have soldiers on 3 sides of them, and they couldn't deal with that. So that was one advantage. Another advantage was flexibility. Hang on. The Roman legion was often described as a hand, and what I mean by that is they would they could, well, the way it was described was the Roman legion could extend and contract. It could like a hand, it could open up and search out for weaknesses with its fingers. Basically, it could expand its formation, because all you would do is you would just move the squares further apart from each other, and they would still be close enough to support each other, but they would be able to cover more ground. And what you could do is you could use that to hunt for weaknesses in the enemy line, test their defenses, explore kind of thing. Or you could clinch up into a fist, which means you could bring all your squares back together into a really tight formation and just have a mass of troops. So it gave you tons of flexibility. It also helps you against terrain, because if you weren't on level ground, like what a phalanx needed, well, you could just adjust your squares to compensate for the new terrain, and you had much greater flexibility and mobility than, say, a Roman phalanx. And the actual makeup changed over Rome's period of tenure, but the legion, the basic concept of the legion, was pretty constant throughout the entire Roman Empire, or Republic/Empire, which was almost like 1,000 years or so. Another thing Rome had going for it early on, starting early on, is they had an actual army. Most people did not have a standing army. I think I talked about that earlier. They had like a National Guard or reserves. They were just normal citizens 90% of the time, and then whenever there was a problem, they'd pick up their gear and then they'd become soldiers. And the reason was because most governments didn't want to, or couldn't, expend the money on a standing army. I mean, a standing army, you have to constantly feed it and clothe it and train it and take care of it 365 days a year. Whereas a National Guard unit or whatnot, or reserves, you only have to shell out money for them when they're needed. So a lot of countries couldn't or didn't want to afford that. It was seen as wasteful, not efficient. Rome, once they got powerful enough and rich enough, just looked at it another way. They realized that by having a standing army, you ensured that your soldiers would always be better than theirs. They would be better trained, better experienced, better accustomed to the life, and most importantly, not worried about if their crops are failing back home, because they're not farmers, they're soldiers. So they don't have any objections or problems going out on extended campaigns like everyone else did. Everyone else wanted to get everything done over and quickly and then get back to their fields. A standing army didn't have any such problems. So Rome found out early on that while the cost was much more, sure, the benefits way outweighed the costs. Their soldiers were always superior, almost always superior to who they were fighting, because that's what they were. They were soldiers. They weren't farmers. They were soldiers when needed. They were just soldiers. They trained all the time. They slept on the ground. You understand what I'm saying. And it was a massive advantage when it came to fighting other people. So that's pretty much why Rome was so successful. The legion and the standing army. And then, of course, you had really intelligent commanders, and then of course you had the discipline of the legion, which is one of the things that you could talk about because they had a standing army. Like, for example, there was a saying: a Roman legionnaire was taught like first to fight and second to dig. And what they mean by that is the Roman legion was just so disciplined and dedicated that let's say they're on the march. They're marching 1,000 miles to the end of their kingdom to go fight this army. Every single night that they could have possibly have expected an attack or weren't in friendly territory or whatever, every single night they would stop about 4 hours earlier than most armies would, and they would make an encampment. And what I mean by that, when I mean an encampment, I mean they would build a fort. They would dig a trench around the entire encampment that was about 4 feet deep. And then they would use that dirt that they dug up to make an embankment on the other side, meaning like a levee. They give you more height and make it harder for them to get to you. And then behind that levee, they built a palisade, a wooden wall made from logs that they would carry with them every single day on horses and stuff. They made a fence about, what, 10 feet high, something like that, around the entire encampment. Oh, crap. And every single night they would do this. They would dig this ditch around the encampment. They would set up this fence. They would set their tents up exactly the same way every single night, whereas most armies were just kind of haphazard about it. They just put their tents wherever they felt like. Rome, your tent goes here every single time in these rows. And they were always in rows, and they were always very organized. Why? Because you always knew where everything was. You knew where the commander was going to be. You knew where your post was supposed to be, if you were attacked, where to run to, where to go. They were incredibly organized, and basically it made it so that if you wanted to attack the Roman army, you had to besiege them, because almost every single night they were in a fort. And it made their marching slow, but they were never really in a hurry to go anywhere, because like I said, they didn't care about time. Everyone else did. So they didn't mind stopping the march 4 hours early to put up this fort. It made them almost impossible to attack at night. So, yeah, the Roman army was incredibly disciplined, and they, for the most part, would just slaughter everyone they came up against, except for Hannibal. But see, Hannibal was an exception to the rule, and he was exceptional. He was a genius, and that's why Rome had so many problems with him. Hannibal's one of my favorite figures in history, just because the man is nothing short of a pure genius. Literally. Even though he wasn't very successful in the overall scheme of things, he had Rome terrified of him and had them running like little girls for 10 years, basically. Ah! You guys finish him. Go ahead and finish him up. Ah! Okay, good. You can heal me. That'll work too. Oh, come on. Finish him off already. Wow. Thank you. Wow, I'm having so much difficulty. There we go. Getting that last hit in. Gosh. Yay, we did it. So anyway, who's Hannibal? Hannibal, not Hannibal Lecter. In case any of you were wondering, it's not him. Hannibal Barcar is his actual name. And he is a Carthaginian. Well, who are the Carthaginians? Well, the Carthaginians were a civilization that lived in northern Africa. Very powerful during Rome's time. In fact, they were Rome's chief rival. And they opposed Rome pretty much in everything, mostly in trade. And they had two massive wars, and they were called the Punic Wars. And the first Punic War was almost entirely a naval war. Ships versus ships, etc., etc. And the Carthaginians lost it mostly due to Rome's greater ability to produce. Kind of like how America won World War II. Rome could make boats faster and better than Carthage could. So, you know, even if they had comparable losses in combat, Rome was able to replace their losses a lot quicker, and eventually they just won in basically a war of attrition. Well, Hannibal's father, I think Hamilcar was his name, Hamilcar Barcar, was a general for Carthage in the first Punic War, and he was undefeated. He was a great commander, and Roman armies never beat him in combat, and so he always felt that they were cheated, that his country had cheated him, because he always felt that, you know, they were winning. He'd never lost a fight. How could we possibly lose the war? Now, of course, he didn't have a clear grasp on the war as a whole. He just saw what he saw of the war, and what he saw was Carthage was always winning. And he made sure of that. So he was very, very upset when Carthage surrendered.